We're living in extraordinary times. While the church has been struggling in the minority world in the West, in much of the majority world, we've seen unprecedented growth of the global Christian community. With this has come an increased need for leadership training. And yet the pool of local qualified theological educators is often limited, and many colleges and schools look for help from the wider global Christian community. While those from outside can be a huge blessing, teaching cross-culturally is full of often overlooked challenges, and lack of cultural sensitivity can undermine the credibility of cross-cultural educators, distort their message, and threaten the fruit of their ministry. The four of us, César, Joanna, Bob, and I, have each known what it is to make a mess of teaching across cultures, and we have seen others do likewise. Given the pressing need as the global church flourishes, we thought the time was ripe for a text such as this. Our book, Teaching Across Cultures, A Global Christian Perspective, is a deeply practical book, helping you, those of you that want to teach beyond your own cultural context. In the first half of the book, the four of us have each brought windows to the conversation, exploring the intersections of theology, anthropology, and pedagogy. As an introduction for potential readers, we thought this would be a good opportunity for us to briefly introduce ourselves and our material. Bob is the head of the Practical Theology Department at the Theological College of Zimbabwe and has opened our text with an extended story and some theological reflections. Bob, tell us a little bit about these two chapters.
Well, chapter 1, as you've rightly said, is a story, a narrative about a professor, a lecturer who goes to a college overseas somewhere and typically begins with some bad, negative experiences in his class. So he goes to the principal for advice, and the principal gives him that advice. And the whole story around different problems that people face when they teach cross-culturally. It's an introduction to the book because it presents a number of very practical cross-cultural issues or problems that teachers are likely to face. Some of them I've faced myself, and so speaking a little bit from personal experience. The second chapter then, as we move into the rest of the book, looks at the theology of teaching and the theology of culture, because that's what we're doing. We're teaching across cultures. So what is our theology of teaching? Why do we teach? And I'm not talking here just about the subject, but as much as what is God doing in and through us as teachers. And for me, a key aspect here is teaching the gospel divided into two sections. The narrow gospel, which is the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ, which most of us are very familiar with, of course, but also what I call the broad gospel, which is the implications of the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. What does it mean to be a Christian teacher? Why am I teaching this subject or that subject, as the case may be, from a theological perspective? So we look at scripture and we think about why God has called us to teach. And then the second part of that chapter looks very briefly at the theology of culture. Every culture is different and different expectations. But what does that mean? Why should we take cognizance of the differences in our cultures? What is God trying to teach us across our cultures as we teach our subjects? And so, again, we look at some biblical basis for culture and what that means for the gospel. So those are my two chapters, introducing the book with a narrative, a story of some problems that a potential lecturer may face, and then looking at the theology of teaching and the theology of culture.
My two chapters follow on, and they revolve around how differing cultural understandings impact teaching and learning. Teaching cross-culturally can be a rich, transformative experience, but it begins with a choice. And that choice is to enjoy and learn from other cultures. However, this can often be difficult as our natural inclination is to filter our understandings through our own life experiences. Recognizing that our own culture is far from perfect and seeing what is good in other cultures is the starting point for teaching cross-culturally to become a richly transformative experience for you and for your students. Along this transformative journey, it's valuable to have a few hooks to hang your understanding. In my 2 chapters, I introduce you to 4 key ideas to help you on your journey. The first idea is that of collectivism as against individualism. So much of who we are finds its source in the extent to which we see ourselves as individuals or as members of extended communities. The second idea is the notion of vertical versus horizontal power, the extent to which it is seen as appropriate or inappropriate for power and authority to be distributed unequally. A third area is a recognition that people from different cultures process their learning and understanding in fundamentally different ways. Particularly those who have been deeply shaped by Western patterns of learning can tend to look down on others. But by so doing, we lose the rich opportunity for seeing the world in all its diverse beauty. The final area has to do with communication. Quality communication is the essence of good teaching. However, there's multiple barriers that stand in the way of effective communication in a cross-cultural setting. I begin by looking at how culture shapes patterns of communication and rhetoric and the profound impact that has on meaningful instruction. And then I move on to some practical suggestions for teaching through translation and how best to serve those for whom the instructional language is their second or third language. I found personally that if you can grasp these 4 cultural elements and learn to enjoy the difference, you'll be well on the way to being effective in cross-cultural teaching, and you'll be transformed by your experience. Joanna brings our next 2 chapters. Joanna is the academic dean of the Asian Theological Seminary in Manila, Philippines, and has focused first on the issue of assessment and then on the crucial question of being sensitive to and empowering women when teaching across cultures. Joanna, tell us a bit more about your 2 chapters.
Well, I truly enjoyed writing my 2 chapters because they're very close to my experience as a teacher through the years as I evaluated the way I have been doing teaching. So the chapters actually was a sharing of an experience, but at the same time, a learning experience as I do a lot more of research and interviews. So the chapter 5 is about challenges of doing assessment in cross-cultural contexts. The reason we have challenges is because sometimes we do not understand really our students. They bring with them their biographies of learning that are so different from our own stories of learning. And the second is because we have standardized our assessment rubrics and we have not really evaluated them. Most of them we borrowed from the West. And so we've been used to it. And I have done that. You know, I went through a lot of exams, a lot of papers, and a lot of readings and listing down of readings. And I did the same thing for my students. But then I realized that it may be unfair because they're not really showing what learning is all about, or I have not even thought of the learning outcomes. So the significance of student assessment is often ignored because of our tendency to do the usual things. And students do continue to challenge us to rethink the way we do assessments. If truly we are measuring learning, we need to think what will be fair to them. Have we asked the question, what are we measuring in exams and quizzes? In asking for the number of pages of readings, what are we really measuring? cross-cultural realities do challenge the way we do assessment. For example, whose definition of critical thinking is valid? If students are passive in class, do we say that they don't do critical thinking? Or we just don't understand that silent waters run deep? And so it would be the responsibility of the teachers to be able to listen and hear their voices in their own way of saying it and in their own way of writing it. And what are the ways that, that our assessment could engage students beyond speaking, beyond writing, and even through arts? Maybe there are other ways of measuring learning. We are very hard on our definition, Western definition of plagiarism. But do we know that the concept is really foreign to other international students? Have we thought about culturally sensitive and ministry skill promoting learning tasks in a way we do assessment? And so the chapter also includes providing examples as to how you design assessment. I have used the framework of Jane Vella, as well as the framework of backward design or learning by design by Wiggins and McTighe, just to provide some tools of how we do a flexible way of doing assessment that adjusts to the needs and contextual realities of our students, especially that we are training them for ministries. So that's the chapter, and I am still truly learning more about how you do assessment in cross-cultural context. Chapter 6 is about gender issues in cross-cultural teaching. This chapter is filled with life stories of men and women students experience gender bias as to how they responded to these experiences, as well as how these experiences actually either hindered or advanced their learning. In other words, the impact of the experience of gender bias in the classroom. Gender roles play a significant part in learning, and sometimes we are not aware of it. And there are stories of students across cultures that you can read in the article in this chapter. I also included my own story, which is not really unique for many Asian women under white male teachers. The stories of women preachers and how the male preachers and teachers were not welcoming or at least hospitable. Those stories of qualified women qualified to teach, but they could not because the denominational distinctive on the Ministry of Women bars them from being allowed to teach. And you can hear the heartbreak of these students who were sharing who are now ministry workers. In cross-cultural context, there are expectations for men and women, but often professors also bring their own biases towards gender roles. And so they say words or their actions offend students. It would be good for us when we teach cross-culturally to understand what is the contextual understanding of gender and be sensitive to context, getting to know students, what to say and what not to say, and how the male teachers treat women students and how the female teachers treat female students would be very important. And how do we provide hospitable learning spaces for all? Those are my 2 chapters.
Thanks so much, Joanna. Very exciting. César lives in Sao Paulo, Brazil, and serves as president of the highly innovative Community for Interdisciplinary Theological Studies, CETI. César's 2 chapters take us deep into seeing how our cultural baggage can limit our effectiveness in teaching across cultures, and what might be done to find a third space in which mutual respect and learning can take place. César, tell us a bit more about these 2 chapters.
Sure, Perry. Thank you. Well, I co-authored chapter 7 with my Argentine friend Nicolas Panotto, and our topic is emancipating cross-cultural teaching. The fundamental impulse is to help us realize that any cross-cultural encounter also has a political dimension. I'm not speaking in terms of politics or partisan politics, but in terms of power dynamics. Therefore, while teaching cross-culturally, we're always facing the danger of promoting some level of cultural imperialism that dishonors Christ and undermines his mission in the world. So sensitization to the subtle but profound political nature of cross-cultural teaching opens up the possibility for transformative mutual learning in what we may call a third space, as you mentioned, where both teacher and learners bring rich resources to the table. In this chapter, we have sought to explain the challenge and suggest a pathway that can make the cross-cultural teaching encounter a context for emancipatory learning rather than some kind of coercive imposition, even if this kind of imposition is involuntary. For us, it was very interesting to realize that the issues we were discussing in this chapter resonated so strongly with the material we were giving in the counter reflections the reader will find in the second section of the book. And we understand that a wholehearted embrace of the recommendations at the end of this chapter will definitely empower our teaching and enrich our cross-cultural experience. Well, finally, the 8th and last chapter in part 1 speaks about theological humility in cross-cultural teaching. It is a very honest and direct chapter. You will notice that throughout our collection, there is a strong emphasis on humility and learning, and the exercise of humble learning by a teacher becomes more challenging when our theological premises are questioned. So this 8th chapter is an invitation to come with theological humility, with a kind of recognition that what is perceived to be normative in our home community, both in terms of dogmatic content and in theological methodology, this may be limited in limiting. It is from this posture that we can open that third space that we mentioned a couple of times already for mutual transformative growth. Coming with theological humility in terms of how you see, how you feel, and how you do theology is therefore an essential element of this posture. These are my 2 chapters, Perry.
That's great. Thanks, César. I love to finish with the idea of this humility, this listening. The second half of the book is actually quite unique. We contacted friends in theological education across the world and asked them what they most wanted to say to people coming from outside to teach in their particular context. And they were really honest. The end result is over 30 country-specific reflections which provide practical guidelines for living, teaching, and serving within different contexts from all over the globe. Throughout these reflections, as well as in the chapters we have written, as has already been mentioned, the common theme throughout the book is the central importance of humble listening. This book is the only resource that we know of its kind. We've tried to keep the structure straightforward, easy to use, while also respecting the need for ever-deepening understanding. Key to the whole is to remember that transformative cross-cultural teaching has humility and careful listening at its core. While the primary focus of this book is on teaching theology across cultures, the issues at stake are relevant for all cross-cultural engagement, wherever you may go. We'd really encourage you to read Teaching Across Cultures. We believe that you'll be inspired, enriched, informed, and challenged.